Thanks all for popping along to this quick bite session entitled Open Everything, Transparency and Peer Review. My name is Dr. Muriel Swijghuisen Reigersberg. I'm your Research Development Manager working for the portfolio, and one of my briefs is to develop a training program for researchers across the institution, and to do so in the help with professional service staff such as our wonderful librarians, HR and human resources. Today I'll be talking to you together with Edward a little bit about peer review. What exactly is it? How should we do it? And what are the tools nowadays that can help you achieve open peer review, and is sharing always the best way forward? Some questions for you to think about during the course of this presentation. So off we go. I'm up first. Away. Peer review. So why and how? Obviously, peer review is really important, and it is to ensure that your published research is of a good quality no matter what field you're in. Your work is being reviewed by your peers, hence the name peer review, and or your colleagues. They may be one and the same, they may not, it depends. Good, helpful peer reviewers will always remember that it is the quality of research that matters, and they will try and keep authors, help authors achieve their best. So it's not a competition about who gets the best research out where, although some people might like to think this is the case. What matters really most is the quality of your research. Some peer review happens informally, when, for example, you talk to a mentor, your supervisor, or a colleague to read over your work. It may happen in your faculty, or if you're an interdisciplinarian, you may ask somebody else in a different school or faculty to cast their eyes over your submission. It happens with grants, it happens with publications. Sometimes peer review is more formal, when you submit, for example, your writing to a journal or a book publishers, or indeed a grant funding body. That's when peer review happens and people award you merit or not, and give you feedback. Peer review works are valued often more highly than non-peer reviewed works, and this is why it gets interesting with open access in particular, where there's lots of information out on the internet and people want to be reassured that what they are reading is in fact quality research. So for academic career progression, it's always good to have peer reviewed articles, book chapters or books to your name. There's different types of peer review. So we have blind peer review or double-blind peer review, and this is generally where the reviewers and authors do not know each other's identities, and the submissions are generally anonymized before the review process occurs. So what are the pros of this particular approach? Some argue that it allows reviewers to be more objective about the work and its quality if they do not know who the authors are. The cons, well, academia is a small world. The number of times where I've actually blind peer reviewed an article and have known exactly who the author is, because guess what, they presented on the exact same topic at a conference I attended several months ago, is very likely indeed. Sometimes also by the style of writing, you have a very good idea about who's written it, because some people adopt specific ways of communicating their research that are very specific to their own personal profile. Some colleagues also see blind peer review as an opportunity to exact their professional revenge, so they're very, very nasty to whoever has written the article. Now, I must stress this approach is unethical. I suggest you don't replicate it. And remember, it's all about the quality of the research, not a person's professional ego. Types of review. So open peer review, that's slightly different. This is when the author and reviewers are made aware of each other's identities, and in some cases discussion and further dialogue between authors and reviewers is encouraged. So for example, I myself peer review for a journal called Voices. It's an interdisciplinary journal in music health and well-being studies, mainly populated by music therapists, but increasingly also music psychologists and ethnomusicologists. In this journal, I'm encouraged to, where possible, identify myself and to offer helpful suggestions and dialogue to the author. So I've made some really interesting connections through peer reviewing that way, and I've found it very fascinating because I've learned a lot about a field adjacent to mine that I didn't first know, so it was really great. As well as, I hope, also contributed to the career development of a younger scholar, so that was nice as well. So a bit of mentoring going on there through open peer review. The pros, of course, it is argued that open peer review stimulates a more collegiate and altruistic approach to the development of research and its publication. The cons, some say that it impacts negatively on the outcome of the review process because it's been shown that there is some form of unconscious bias towards certain types of authors. So some people would argue that if you are a woman, you're less likely to receive a favorable review than, for example, a man. Or if you are from a non-English speaking background, you're less likely to receive a favorable review than if you are from an English background. All these things are to do with unconscious biases, research has shown. So is this something that counts against peer review? Yes or no, something to think about. Open peer review may also lead to reviewers being too complementary. Say, for example, if there is a conflict of interest or a power imbalance. So I've had an occasion where, as I was saying to Edward, I had to peer review the person who I knew was going to be my external PhD examiner. So that was an interesting one. I chose for blind peer review, by the way, in that particular circumstance. So I think there are cases where perhaps you want to be careful and need to be aware of these conflicts of interest and power imbalances when it comes to open peer review. So good peer review. Well, some journals or book publishers will offer you a template to follow. So you just go ahead and follow the criteria that they would like you to address. Generally speaking, when I peer review and I'm not offered a template, the things I tend to do is first read the article, obviously, or submission, then summarize the submission briefly to show that I've understood the main arguments and the points that the author is trying to make. I will try and comment on the significance of the piece of work, the timeliness of the findings, and what I feel is the contribution or magnitude of the contribution to the field. I will consider the appropriate of the methods, and this is as much to social sciences as it would be STEM, in relation to the results or the theory that's been published. If you're an arts and humanitarian scholar where articles tend to be quite a lot longer, say 6 to 10,000 words usually, you will also want to look at structure, style, and flow of the arguments. They are very important as well. So are they in a logical order in a way that is easy to follow for the reader? Assess whether the conclusions drawn are accurate and valid based on the evidence presented and not extrapolated inappropriately. So I've had a few of those in the past, which would be quite interesting. And with the open peer review process, it was quite handy because I could actually go back to the author and say, I know what you're getting at, but it's not actually in your article. Could you please clarify? And they say, oh yeah, no, sorry, forgot to write that down, but I do have the evidence, I'll stick it in. I'm like, okay, well that's all right then, thank you very much. And offer helpful suggestions, and I underline helpful, so just saying this piece is rubbish and then returning the manuscript is not helpful. Try and be as helpful as you can with your approach to peer reviewing, and where possible offering examples, if necessary, of what you would like to see. I've had some terribly good peer reviewers, in my case, who have been very kind to me and even offered me some spell checking services and direct references to literature that they thought would be really useful. So kudos to them. So for my part, tips to take away. Also, when you're building a track record in terms of peer reviewing, manage your time wisely and balance your review with your own writing and research needs. Peer reviewing is something we all have to do. It's a great thing to do. You learn a lot through it, but don't forget you too need to publish yourself. If you actually spend most of your time peer reviewing, your own article will never get written. So bear that in mind. Be sure to peer review things where you actually feel you have a genuinely helpful contribution to make. Increasingly, with a lot of open peer review systems, people are asking you to review lots of articles where perhaps you've expressed an interest in an area of research, but it's not your main field. So, for example, I published in conjunction with a computer scientist, ended up in F1000 journal, which is an open access journal. And as a consequence now, for some reason, I get lots of peer review requests in computer studies, which really is not my field. I'm an ethnomusicologist and music and health scholar, so I say no. Also be prepared to say no when you are too busy or if you are in the process of revising your own manuscripts, because what you need to be learning, especially if you are an early and mid-career scholar, is how to manage your time. And sometimes prioritizing your own work or deadlines over a peer review request may become necessary as you build up prestige and visibility in your field. So those are my takeaway tips. This concludes my part of the session. I will now hand over to my wonderful colleague, Edward, who works for the library.
Thank you, Muriel. Okay, I just wanted to start with, I want to talk a little bit more about open peer review specifically. I want to touch on a couple of models for how this might work, because it is a fairly broad term that gets used in a number of different ways. So I sort of wanted to unpack that a little bit. And I guess a question to sort of start this off is that if every single peer review that you've ever written were suddenly made visible to the world, if it was suddenly made open access or even attributed to you as the author, would you stand by those reviews? Would you be happy for them to be out there? The answer should be yes, but oftentimes it may not be. And I think this is quite an interesting question. And sort of something that underscores open peer review is that generally it results in a higher quality of review because you are aware that your name is attached to it, and there's a bit more accountability there, I guess. In terms of context, I just wanted to provide a bit of background because I think open peer review slots in very nicely with respect to other sort of forms of openness, whether we're talking about open access, open scholarship, open data, or any of those sort of things. And I guess what's interesting about the academic landscape today is that we're getting pressure from a number of different areas. So I've highlighted some of these here. Funding bodies, of course, are increasingly requiring that publicly funded research be made available open access. If you look at the sort of policies for an ARC grant or an NHMRC grant, it's quite clear that there is a trend towards openness and enabling this research to get out there. In terms of institutions, thinking about the University of Sydney specifically, well, increasingly we're seeing universities get on board with open access policies of their own, and they're coming up with various sort of mandates and approaches to encourage greater dissemination of the university's research output. That may be through the institutional repository, which is a form of green open access, so depositing or self-archiving a version of your work that can be made open, typically a preprint, to ensure that your work is getting out there. It could also be around something like implementing open standards such as ORCID, which has been a project that's been happening recently at the university where people have been able to connect their research output to a public profile called ORCID. And increasingly, you're also being required as you go for grants and as you go for promotions to think about what impact your research is actually having in the real world and what sort of engagement with industry you can potentially offer. And this is, again, relating to, I guess, taking your work outside an academic context and thinking about how you can actually market it to other audiences and other communities. Researchers themselves are getting on board with open access, albeit a bit slower than perhaps some of us would like. But we're seeing non-traditional forms of scholarship becoming sort of essential aspects of publication strategy. We're often being told these days that we need to have a social media strategy, that we need to write an article in the conversation, that we need to think of other ways of expressing our work beyond the traditional journal article, acknowledging the fact that a traditional journal article will be read by academics and academics only. And instead, we need to consider how we might be speaking to other audiences. And then publishers as well. There's some interesting pressures there as publishers are increasingly trying to craft business models around open access, which might be typically called gold open access, and also experimenting with their own sort of models for open scholarship and sort of trying to appear to sort of appease and align with these other kind of pressures in the marketplace. So I think that's quite interesting. I just wanted to show you an example of what open peer review can look like. This is from the journal actually that Muriel mentioned earlier called F1000 Research. And if we have a look on the right-hand side here, we can see that there have actually been 5 peer reviewers for this article and 3 versions of the work before we get to the version that we're looking at here. And we have complete accountability here because we can see who exactly has reviewed that work. And if we pop down to the bottom of the article, we can actually read these peer review comments ourselves. So this is a peer review comment being made by a professor by the name of Peter Suber, and he's actually saying, you've misinterpreted a point in my article. This is actually what I meant. Here are some references that you might want to add in support of this. So quite sort of interesting, and I think F1000 also has an open comments section as well, so you can have discussion with a general audience outside the peer review process. So who's actually engaging in open peer review? A number of different publishers are hopping on board, and I've listed a few examples here. And again, this is something that's happening in quite a piecemeal fashion. So somewhere like Biomed Central, for example, it's only a series of select journals that are opting for a policy of open peer review. PeerJ, for example, they have an optional model, so you can elect to have your article openly peer reviewed, but it's not essential. BMJ is another kind of interesting example. In terms of, I guess, the flavours of open peer review, this is really quite interesting. There was a study recently done, and it was looking at what do we actually mean by open peer review. And they came up with these sort of qualities that are sort of happening in kind of different ways and different forms for various publishers. And I thought it was kind of interesting to go through these. So I guess, yeah, these are the different forms or components that might make up open peer review. So we have open identities. This is where the author and the reviewer alike are aware of each other's identity. And this is typically what we might think of when we think of open peer review. There's also open reports where the reviews themselves are published alongside the relevant article. This is what we saw with the F1000 example. Once you've read the article, you can go down and look at the peer review comments. They're there. F1000 is also an example of open participation because there is an open comment section that anybody can comment on at the bottom of that article. There's also this notion of open interaction, which is a direct conversation between authors and reviewers. And this takes place sort of outside the framework of here's a review report, here's the changes that I've made, but there's a bit more dialogue and conversation between the author and the reviewer. Additionally, there's also open pre-review manuscripts. So a preprint version of the work is made available, typically through a subject repository, and this is actually in advance of the formal peer review process. So the article's already out there, you can get some feedback, and then you might elect for a particular outlet to publish that work. Open final version commenting, is another version, and so this is, again, open commenting, but happening on the final version of record. So there's kind of a continuing conversation evolving beyond the article itself being made available. And then this last one is kind of interesting and something that we're not seeing quite as much, and that's this notion of open platforms, which is that the peer review process is actually managed by a third party. So beyond the publisher themselves, the process is kind of being managed. One of the sort of interesting things about open peer review is that it enables greater recognition for peer reviewers, because we acknowledge that peer review takes a significant amount of your time. If you're looking at 3 or 4 articles in a month, that's hours of workload, and typically we haven't had a good way of kind of capturing that. So we are seeing the emergence of some services that actually allow you to document and make visible the contributions that you've made in the space of peer review. So one such example is Publons, and this they sort of act as a liaison with publishers, and you create a profile on Publons, and then you actually document any peer reviews that you've completed, and then it gives you a record which you can actually use as evidence to say these are the peer reviews that I've completed. Publons also links to ORCID, which I mentioned earlier. So ORCID is your online CV, a free and open sort of summation of you as a researcher, and it captures things like grants and publications and your education history. But it's also more recently linking in with peer reviews as well. So services like Publons can actually push information about your peer reviews to your profile. So for the first time, your academic profile actually captures your contributions in the space of peer review. And I guess sort of a final point to underscore that is the idea that greater trust and accountability sort of naturally occurs when things are transparent. As Muriel has mentioned, there are some sort of caveats to that, which is why sort of ethical peer review is so crucial and why it is important to turn down peer review opportunities as it is to accept peer review opportunities. So here's Publons again, just to mention this. It's quite interesting because a number of universities are actively supporting their researchers to get on Publons. I think the University of Sydney, there might be 300 academics that are currently using Publons to capture their peer review. It's something that I think we're going to see a lot of growth in sort of in the coming years. So both publishers and institutions are backing platforms like Publons. And just to mention F1000 research again, this is quite interesting because it doesn't adhere to the typical kind of journal and issue structure that we've had in the past, where now you can sort of publish under a particular subject area, but it's not under a particular journal title. This is quite interesting because it means that you don't have the same kind of process of waiting for an issue to come out, perhaps a journal that publishes 4 issues in a year. You can upload something to F1000 and you can get a version of it made available within a week sometimes. So it's a much more rapid form of scholarly communication. This is just their publishing process. So for any of these platforms, the peer review process, they're going to be quite sort of transparent about what they are actually going to do with the article. So we can see here that the article itself is submitted, and then you have about a week until a version of it is made available open. You can also publish open data with that as well, which is quite interesting. And then the article is then open for open peer review and commenting. You go through a number of revisions, and then when everyone's satisfied with the article, you sort of have the version on record at the end. But you can always go back and you sort of have the paper trail. You can see those peer reviews and you can see the revisions that have been made to that article. And this is quite different from traditional journal publishing, where this process has been sort of behind the scenes, potentially a little bit murky. We don't really know how peer reviewers are selected and that sort of thing. So this is quite a sort of different model. Finally, I just wanted to mention the Winnower, which is another example of one of these platforms. It doesn't have traditional journals and sort of issues, but they're quite loose in terms of the structure of the work that you want to upload. So as it says at the bottom, you can publish class essays, grants, letters, how-to articles. There is really no kind of, there aren't that many guidelines around the structure of your work, but it provides a platform for you to upload your work and make it available to open peer review and to elicit contributions from the community, which is quite interesting. You can also assign a DOI to that work, that's a digital object identifier, and have it archived in perpetuity, which is quite interesting. And this is just one example of many that are sort of out there in the market today. And this is all being enabled both by sort of rapid technological change, which is sort of shifting the way that scholarly communication occurs, but also, again, this trend towards openness, transparency, and accountability. So just some final thoughts, and feel free to pitch in where you like. So as I said, I think that this reflects this changing nature of scholarly communication. You know, it's a shift away from traditional sort of practices of guarding knowledge, sort of the notion of the ivory tower, of knowledge being sort of guarded and kept behind closed doors, and rather reflecting a new kind of landscape of openness and collaboration. Whenever you make a publishing decision, whenever you identify a publisher or a journal that you would like to work with, you need to make sure that you're aware of their policies around peer review, just as much as you're aware of their policies around open access or preprints or any of those kind of issues. And, you know, be empowered by this kind of thing. You can use it as a factor in your decision around whether you want to publish with a particular vendor. You can use a tool such as Publons to receive recognition for your reviews. Looking at the statistics for Awkward, I think there are only 1,000 authors at this point that have peer review information on their profiles. But I could see in sort of the next 5 years that this is going to be an area of rapid expansion. So it's good for you to be sort of aware of these kinds of issues as well. And then finally, just one point from me, be frank but kind when writing your review. Otherwise, you're better off turning it down rather than sort of scarring anybody. Muriel.
And I'm going to add as my final thoughts, don't be afraid to experiment yourselves as well. I have done, and I concluded that, for example, F1000 is not especially well suited to arts and humanities scholars because you don't have the clear sections of hypothesis, method, conclusion, you end up inevitably using the opinions template, which in my particular case, it wasn't genuine research, not merely an opinion. And other systems, for example, that I have trialed are Figshare, which is more friendly towards uploading larger amounts of content if you are dealing with creative outputs that perhaps could do with some audiovisual exampling, which is why technologies are so exciting. But what I encountered there, of course, is that I ran into copyright and sharing issues. Very important to think about when you're open peer reviewing as well and have creative content you would like to share and have reviewed, because you shouldn't just be whacking everything online without thinking about it. There may be things to consider in terms of artist income and revenue and other things like that that are really important to your field. So don't be afraid to experiment, don't be afraid to participate in developing new technologies, and do also feel compelled, for those of you who have the time and interest, to feedback and enter into these discussions so that together we can move this field a little bit more forward, because it offers great opportunities, but as we hope we have shown, there are also some challenges that we need to consider, and we need to think about this as a scholarly community. It's not really just up to the publishers